In this video, I'm discussing unpredictability and volatility in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. I should make it clear at the outset that my discussion is based on the products produced for the game rather than their associated rules or changes in the meta. My criticisms and concerns are not being directed at the design or aesthetic of individual AOS models. Rather, I'm concerned by the lack of perceived clarity and direction and the consequential sense of volatility and unpredictability in a game that has now existed for almost 10 years. I've been a long-term fan of AOS since day one, July 2015, so I'm not an innate critic of this game, nor am I prone to dramatic or excessive emotion. Whatever frustration I express on this topic is meant to be constructive criticism. Simply put, I want AOS to succeed, and I want GW to do better. And with that preamble, let's get into it. No one who is in the hobby during the initial weeks, months, and years of AOS can say that the game had a smooth start. From AOS 1.0 to our current 4.0, the game has changed dramatically. Initially proudly promoted as 4 pages of rules and 0 points, that initial offering and vision has steadily eroded and completely reversed by 2.0 in 2018. And since then, it's been kind of increasingly adopted this hyper-competitive mindset, which is fine. From a product perspective, the turbulence really began during the end times, when factions were reoriented, characters killed, and armies rebranded. Initially, as dedicated AOS models were slowly being rolled out, they had to retain the bulk of Warhammer Fantasy models and products. Each traditional army was divided into further subdivisions based on aesthetics. For example, the once cohesive High Elves range was divided into the Eldritch Council, Lion Rangers, Order Draconis, Shadow Blades, Phoenix Temple, and Swift Hawk Agents. And basically that happened to all of them. And some units even switched factions entirely. And every Warhammer Fantasy Battle faction received this kind of chaotic treatment. At one point, Firebellies seemed to be its own thing, despite only having a single representative model. In the formative years, Bone Splitters had their own dedicated book. Clan Pestilence of Skaven had their own dedicated book. Beastclaw Raiders had their own dedicated book. There seemed to be plans for all of these until there wasn't. The first cuts were announced mere months after the game launched. Bretonnians were cut, Tomb Kings were cut, all but one of the High Elf sub-factions were cut. The Phoenix Temple stuck around for a few more years and even received some dedicated rules and narrative support before they were also cut. Now, possibly these things come back at some point, but who knows? Wanderers and Dispossessed received the same treatment before they were also cut. Many, but not all, of the Dark Elves were cut. It's a long list of half-promises and subsequent cuts, and I have questions about each and every one of those decisions. Some seem obvious, while others seemed simply chaotic, and regardless of kind of the brevity or longevity, the timing was sometimes suspicious. Then there was the constant rebranding, merging, and separating of factions, from Legions of Nagash splitting into Nighthaunt and Soulblight Gravelords, to Ogres and Beastclaw Raiders becoming Maw Tribes, to Bone Splitters and Ironjaws becoming War Clans. You were perpetually left with the impression of plans made and plans changed. No one knew precisely why, what, or how, and nothing was ever communicated. Instead, you were left with the impression of chaotic flux that justified the game's critics and left its supporters bewildered. But that can all be forgiven in the earliest years, and they were crazy, man. Again, as someone that was in this hobby, in AOS, on day one, it was a wild ride. They were created a new game, in a brand new narrative, with the remnants of the Warhammer Fantasy line. Cuts, of course, were to be expected, and a degree of trial and error is understandable during the transitional period. All that can be forgiven in the short term. In the short term. The problem is that after almost 10 years, the AOS product line is still fairly unpredictable. Both Bone Splitters and Beasts of Chaos persisted for years, and even received a limited number of new products before they were also systematically cut from the game. Much of the original Warcry line has been discontinued. The entire Stormcast Eternals The Sacrosanct Chamber, along with many other supporting characters, have been cut. There is some talk among hobbyists that they'll return at some point, but no one really knows. In my opinion, they've adopted an unsustainable approach to Stormcast Eternals that all but ensures freaking cuts. But the volatility and unpredictability does not only apply to armies. Over the years, faction terrain and endless spells were introduced haphazardly. Some armies received one, but not the other, or simply neither. Part of this might be how models are designed by GW, but it seems inherently chaotic. For instance, it's mind-boggling that some dedicated AOS armies have not received that support, while Beasts of Chaos received both before being cut. I'll also point out that 40k received faction terrain, but it's more limited and treated dramatically different within the game. When AOS first launched in 2015, armies led by Tyrion and Malekith, now known as Malarian, were teased. Few expected these armies to be imminently released, but did anyone honestly expect they would 10 plus years and there'd still be no sign of them? Again, there's some discussion that they'll come out maybe this year or the next, who knows? But really this long? When the Incarnate Gur was released, did anyone think it would only be one? Supposedly one was designed and subsequently scrapped. If so, why? With 8 realms to explore, did anyone think we would be narratively fixated on Gur for years? I initially thought that they would come out of a general's handbook on every single realm, and I was thinking, boy, an 8-year cycle, that's crazy. And then like 3 years later, we're still in Gur or something. It's just mind-boggling. I look at Blackstone Fortress, and I notice that many models have been incorporated into the 40k line. I look at Curse City, and I see a game that without explanation was quickly discontinued, and after a period of time, available again. Of course, there are plenty of rumors to account for what happened, but no one knows the answer. The models of the game are supported in AOS, but are currently no longer available. Could they come back? Yes. Will they? No one knows. More recently, the traditional Collector's Edition Battle Tomes were replaced with Gamer Editions. Why is this only available in AOS? I've been in this hobby, approaching 3 decades, and during that time, battle tomes and army books and codexes and things like that have been treated the same for both games. And you would think, if they were going to roll this something out in a pre-planned, long-term vision of what they're doing, they would have done this at the start of 40k and did AOS the subsequent year. Right? They're not going to start this in 40k until 2027? Like it's 2026? It's just mind-boggling to me. The uncertainty really extends to other AOS specialist games, like Underworlds and Warcry. Some Underworlds warbands are supported in 4th edition, but many are not. Some Underworlds warbands have even been fully integrated within the AOS line. But again, many have not, and not every AOS faction has received the same treatment. Kill Team and Warcry seem like near equivalents to each other, but the relationship to their core games is radically different. How the model kits are designed is radically different. Their place within the product lines are radically different. Unlike 40k and Kill Team, I'm curious about the longevity of Warcry warbands in AOS. I'm cautious about it. And some factions like Slave to Darkness already have seen significant cuts from that line. Are you starting to see the pattern here with AOS? I don't understand. They have every right to discontinue products and launch new products. My discontent is with the seemingly haphazard approach. It's the inconsistent approach without communication. It feels as though they lack a sense of direction and are still perpetually experimenting. Plans made and plans changed, over and over. In 2019, a mere 4 years after AOS launched and Warhammer Fantasy Battle discontinued, Old World was launched in 4 years. It took another 5 years, but they eventually rolled out their new fantasy game. They initially promised the moon and launched something much more modest. I view the relationship between Horus Heresy and 40k and Old World and AOS as akin to celestial bodies in a binary system. Both the core game and the supplemental game are inexorably intertwined and revolve around one another. But the relationship between Horus Heresy and 40k is largely harmonious. The relationship between AOS and Old World is chaotic. AOS used many Warhammer Fantasy Battle products and archetypes upon launch. This was a necessary bridge to the new setting. And although many dedicated AOS products have been released in the intervening years, many AOS factions remain reliant on Warhammer Fantasy Battle products. That said, the scope of Old World is smaller, with only 9 core factions, just over half of those supported in Warhammer Fantasy. I have questions about how they settled on the Old World setting and its associated factions, but in the short term, it means that some AOS factions are not caught in Old World's chaotic vortex. However, in the lead up to Old World, GW systematically refused to address, acknowledge, or advocate for any degree of cross-compatibility between the lines. This has led to a series of unfortunate decisions, in my opinion, and such as releasing old resin models, right, and products when new plastic equivalents exist. Beast of Chaos received comparatively few AOS products, but the line was seemingly cut from AOS because it couldn't fathom the existence of both of the line being used simultaneously in both games. The AOS Cities of Sigmar line was once largely reliant on Warhammer Fantasy Empire models, but thankfully received new models in 2023. The majority of Empire models are now being repackaged for Old World, but some, like the Steam Tank, still have rules in AOS. Others, like the Luminarch of Hysh and the Celestial Huracanum, seem to be staying permanently in AOS, and GW has taken the unusual step of actually reissuing or adjusting plastic kits to remove all references to Karl Franz. Remnants of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, dwarves and dark elves were also included in the AOS Cities of Sigmar. Now, the dark elves remain for the unforeseeable future, although they are largely website exclusive. The remaining dwarf units were repackaged for Old World earlier this year. Now, these are still being included within the regularly updated rules and unit roster of AOS, but they're no longer being sold under the AOS banner, and they now come with square bases. Right? Is there a future for Ironbreakers and Steam Tanks in Cities of Sigmar? Honestly, no clue. Are they receiving new models tailored to AOS? No clue. What will happen to the Sylvaneth line when the Wood Elf Realms is released and Dryads and Tree Lords are likely repackaged for Old World? No clue. Right? Are you starting to see the pattern? Now, at the end of 2024, after a year of Old World rollouts, we come to the newly revealed Gitmob for Gloomspite Gitz. It's a beautiful army, and a cool army that sums up basically everything that's wrong with the AOS product line, in my opinion. So, some context. Currently, there's an Old World faction called Orc and Goblin Tribes. In Warhammer Fantasy, this was simply called Orcs and Goblins, and it contained a lot of different aesthetics and subcultures. When AOS launched, they split the Orc and Goblin line into 4 distinct armies. Bone Splitters were created from Savage Orcs. Iron Jaws were largely new, but relied heavily on Black Orcs. Gloomspite Gitz were created from the Night Goblins and the spider-riding Forced Goblins, and Greenskins were a catch-all for the remaining Orc and Goblin models. Importantly, these goblins had the Gitmob keyword. Okay? Greenskins never received dedicated products, but they had rules. They were included in the community survey. They had their own start collecting box. They were a full-fledged army until they were discontinued and cut from the game. But now they're back, right? And our game of magical chairs, army magical chairs, has them listed under the umbrella of Gloomspite Gitz this time. Now, the old Goblin Wolf Riders were re-released earlier this year for Old World, and the release of Gitmob for AOS simply kind of accentuates the disparity. These were designed a quarter century apart. Remember, no cross-compatibility between these two lines. Likewise, the old Goblin Doom Driver was released for Old World this past year, and the new version will be released for AOS shortly. This situation is ridiculous. This continued entanglement is ridiculous. Why not design something different? Why not simply call them different names? Anyone who thought that Old World would release with a completely new line of models was probably delusional, but it's also true that the game's greatest liability is its reliance on old out-of-date models. The future could be bright for Old World once the dust settles, but currently it's entirely fueled by nostalgia. I simply cannot answer why this new army for AOS was not included under the Old World banner instead. There's little about them that actually screams AOS. There are so many AOS armies that have not gotten the product support they need to truly thrive. Gloomspite was not one of the languishing factions. Are Gitmob really appropriate under the Gloomspite banner? The Gloom made sense because their devotees were largely hiding in caves, as per the old Night Goblin aesthetic. Surely they can write something that justifies the umbrella and the connection to the moon or whatever, but does it fit them well? Not only that, these will play dramatically different. Goblins on wolves have traditionally been among the fastest units in any game. For the past couple years, there have been talk and discussion of splitting Warwick war clans into distinct Ironjaws and Cruel Boys books, as they probably should, giving them the individual attention that they deserve. And then they come along and do the same thing to Gloomspite, by having one book cover multiple armies. It's as though they don't want to sell books. Perhaps we should have seen this coming, We have Rippa's Snarlfanes in 2020, and a separate Snarlfanes unit in 2023. But the truth is that I was really confused by those releases. They're 3 years apart for one thing, right? They had the Gloomspite keyword, but they didn't feel like Gloomspite. And personally, I bought them, but I added them to my fantasy collections, not AOS. The fact that these kits staggered out slowly over 5 years is part of the problem. This reveal caught many by surprise, but they shouldn't have. Now, serendipity and surprises are fun, right? It's cool to be shocked with something cool and exciting. And I was excited for the AOS factions like Ideneth, like the Caradron Overlords, when they all launched. They were new, strange, and generally unexpected. Gitmob should be in that category, but I don't see them that way. It's more in the category of disbelief or WTF. Change is great when you have the confidence that they know what they're doing. I don't have that. I worry about volatility in AOS because its history is littered with what seem like reverse decisions. They haven't given me reason to think that they are committed to a well thought out and clear strategy. That might exist, but they're not communicating that, and it feels chaotic. Are you starting to see the pattern? Are Spiderfang going to be in the upcoming Gloomspite book? I don't know. You can make a solid argument that they will not be included. After all, they've only seen cuts. Not a single new kit in 10 years. Bone Splitters had 100% more releases. You cannot form an argument today that would make me 100% confident that they are included, based on the products. Not based on narrative. Nothing. The culture and history of this game shouldn't be so one-sided. Spiderfang could very well be in the next book. I have no clue, right? but I'm not going to be shocked when they're not. I like the Gitmob models. I think that they look cool. And I'm going to buy them because I'm a crazy collector. In that sense, GW rarely pays a penalty. The sculpts are always amazing, but that doesn't mean I'm happy with how GW has handled products for this game over the past 10 years. It simply feels chaotic. It feels uncertain. At best, it seems as though AOS is the exploratory and experimental game. They're simply willing to do things in AOS that they would never risk in 40k. Perhaps they play things too safe in 40k, to be honest. But from a confidence and product standpoint, the contrast between AOS and 40k is stark. The history of 40k has simply taken the opposite approach. They made large-scale cuts in the 90s and early 2000s, and it's true that some product lines faltered and were left to languish, but in more recent years, really frankly in much of the last 2 decades, it's been nothing but blue sky. When they changed the scale of Space Marines and introduced Primaris, the old models weren't spontaneously discontinued, right? As I kind of expected. They were very slowly and methodically phased out over many years, and many remain available even to this day. Discontinued armies, like Genestealer cults and Leagues of Votann, have returned. Languishing lines like the Adeptus Sororitas, Black Templars, and Eldari have been renewed. Plastic Death Corps of Krieg and a fully independent Emperor's Children are on the horizon. I know there are many more to be explored or renewed, but to each and every one of my general sense is not an uncertain, will this ever be released? But when will it be released? It could take some time, perhaps years, but I have nothing but optimism on that front. I look at the core lines of 40k, Horus Heresy, and even Old World with a great sense of predictability and optimism. I don't know what will be revealed next week or next month, but I have confidence in the long-term prospects. And I wish I shared that same confidence with regards to AOS. If you made it this far, thank you for listening, and I'd love to know your opinion.